The morning the Duke of Ashbourne dismissed the midwife, the great house at Wenlock held its breath. It was the 3rd week of November, the season's first frost. Still white on the lawns, and Eleanor Hartley stood at the foot of the servants' stair with her bag already packed, because she had been told to leave by noon, and she was a woman who did not waste the hours she was given. Above her, in the blue bedchamber, the young Duchess lay too pale against the bolster. 3 days from her confinement, and the household physician had pronounced the case simple. Eleanor knew it was not simple. She had set her hand on that swollen wrist an hour before, and felt the pulse stutter where it should have run smooth. And she had said so, plainly, in front of the physician and the dowager and the Duke himself, and for the saying of it she had been turned out. To the household, she was only the midwife from the village, a woman of no family and less fortune, and the dowager had named her so within Eleanor's hearing, with a particular coolness reserved for those who had forgotten their place. Stay with me, if you would, because what that woman carried in her plain canvas bag was a knowledge that would, before the month was out, change everything in that cold and gilded house. The Duke had not looked at her when he gave the order. He had looked at the window, his jaw set like carved stone, and only at the last moment, as she gathered her cloak, had his gaze come to rest on her with something she could not read and did not trust herself to name. She had been 6 years a midwife in the parish of Wenlock, and in those 6 years she had caught 200 children and buried fewer than any other woman within 30 miles, and she had learned to read a body the way a sailor reads weather. The physician, Dr. Pelham, read books. He had told the Duke that the Duchess suffered only from the natural tremors of a first confinement, that rest and a little wine would settle her, and he had said it with the confidence of a man who had never sat through a night listening to a woman's breath change. Eleanor had sat through 40 such nights. She had heard the catch in the Duchess's breath that afternoon, the faint blue at the lips that came and went, the swelling that had climbed past the ankles to the hands, and she had felt the headache the young woman would not confess because confessing it seemed weak. These were not the natural tremors of anything. These were the early footsteps of the thing that took mothers in their beds and left the great houses draped in black. She gathered her cloak and went out through the kitchen where the cook pressed a heel of bread into her hands and would not meet her eyes, and into the courtyard, where the frost crunched under her worn boots. She did not go far. She got as far as the lodge gate, and there she stopped, because she could not make her feet carry her past it. Somewhere behind her a young woman of 19 was being told to rest and drink wine, and Eleanor knew with the certainty of long practice that rest and wine would kill her. The great house of Wenlock had stood 300 years, and the Hartley name had never once been spoken inside it as anything but a tradesman's account. Eleanor's father had been a country apothecary, a careful, gentle man who had taught her to grind a powder and read a fever before she could read her letters, and when the fever he could not read took him, he had left her his books, his scales, and his habit of looking hard at what other people glanced past. Her mother had died, bringing her into the world, and Eleanor had grown up knowing the exact shape of the thing she now fought, because it had made her motherless before she drew her first breath. That was the wound she carried, and she carried it without speaking of it, the way she carried the small brass scale in her bag that had been her father's, worn smooth at the edges by his thumb and now by hers. The Duke of Ashbourne was a man of 32 who had inherited the title 4 years past, and a great deal of grief along with it. Marcus Ashbourne had married the young Duchess in the spring, a match arranged between 2 families with adjoining lands and competing debts, and the village said he had married for the acreage and not for the girl. The village said a great many things. What the village did not know was that the Duke had buried a sister in childbed 2 winters before. A sister he had loved past all reason and had failed, in his own accounting, to save, because he had trusted a confident physician over the frightened woman in the bed. He did not speak of Charlotte. There was a portrait of her turned to face the wall in the long gallery, and there was a folded letter he carried in the breast of his coat that he had never once let anyone see. These were the only outward signs of a grief that had hardened his face into the stillness the household mistook for coldness. So when Eleanor stood in the blue bedchamber and said the Duchess was in danger, The Duke had felt something move in him that he did not welcome. He had heard a frightened woman warning of a death once before. He had ignored her, and Charlotte had died. The easy thing, the safe thing, was to believe Dr. Pelham, because Pelham promised that nothing was wrong and the Dowager wanted Pelham believed, and the whole weight of the house leaned toward the comfortable verdict. Dismissing the midwife was the comfortable verdict made flesh. He had given the order to be rid of the feeling she stirred in him, and the moment the words left his mouth, he had wanted them back. The Dowager Duchess, his mother, was a woman who had governed Wenlock for 30 years and did not intend to surrender it to a village woman with opinions. Lady Ashbourne had a way of holding her fan a half-inch too high when she was displeased, and she had held it so all through Eleanor's warning. To her, the order of the world was not cruelty but architecture. A midwife was a midwife. A duchess was a duchess. A physician trained at Edinburgh did not take instruction from a woman who smelled of the birthing room, and any house that permitted such a thing was a house with rot in its beams. She had pressed her son to dismiss the woman not from malice, but from a certainty. So total it had never once been tested, and she watched the midwife cross the courtyard with the satisfaction of a gardener who has pulled a weed. Eleanor did not leave, though she stood at the lodge gate in the cold, and she opened her father's books in her mind, and she went through them again, the symptoms laid out like a hand of cards, and every card pointed the same way. There was a thing that came in late confinement, a poison the body made against itself, that announced itself exactly as the Duchess had shown it, and left untreated, it brought the fits. And after the fits, it brought the dark. She had seen it twice. She had saved one and lost one, and the one she lost had haunted her for 3 years, a farmer's wife named Sally Coombe, whose children still left flowers on a grave. Eleanor could not pass without slowing. She would not stand at a gate and let it happen a 3rd time, because a duke preferred a comfortable lie. So she did a thing that could have ended her livelihood in the parish forever. She turned around, walked back across the frost, and went in by the kitchen door. It was Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper, who let her stand by the fire, an old woman with flour on her apron and 40 years of the house in her bones, and it was Mrs. Beer. Doyle, who told her in a low voice that the young Duchess had asked for her by name not an hour past and been told the midwife was gone. That was the lever Eleanor needed. A patient might dismiss a physician. A household might dismiss a tradeswoman. But a duchess who asked for a particular woman had, by the codes of the house itself, a claim that even the dowager could not entirely brush aside. Eleanor sent Mrs. Doyle up the back stair with 4 words, that the midwife was below and would come if she were sent for. And then she sat by the kitchen fire with her father's scale in her hand, and she waited. She waited 2 hours. The kitchen filled and emptied with the business of a great house, the spit boy turning a joint that hissed and dripped, the scullery maid scouring a copper pot until her knuckles whitened, a footman coming through with a tray of glasses that chimed against one another and going out again without a word. The cook, a broad, red-armed woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had fed 3 generations of the family, set a bowl of broth at Eleanor's elbow and said only that a body could not think on an empty stomach, and Eleanor thanked her and let it go cold. The under-footman looked at her sidelong because the whole house now knew she had been turned out and had not gone. And a kitchen is a parliament of opinion, and the opinion of the kitchen had not yet decided what she was. A young maid of perhaps 14, sent down for hot water, paused at the foot of the stair, and stared at the village woman who had defied the dowager, and Eleanor met her eyes, and the girl fled, blushing up the steps. Eleanor did not move. She sat with her back straight and her father's scale turning in her hands, and she counted, in the quiet, under the kitchen's noise, the hours the Duchess had left if no one acted. She had learned in 6 years of the work that the most important thing a person could do at a bedside was to remain. Simply to remain, when remaining was inconvenient, when leaving was easier, when the body in the bed had nothing to offer in return for the staying. That was the whole of her trade. When the powders and the scales were set aside, she stayed. What she did not know was that the Duke had come down the front stair an hour into her waiting, and stood unseen at the green baize door that divided the family's wing from the servants', one hand flat against the worn wood, and watched her through the gap where the door hung a half-inch open. He had come down meaning to confirm she had gone, and to be done with the unease of her. Instead, he found her sitting by the kitchen fire with a small brass instrument, turning over and over in her chapped hands, her lips moving without sound, and he stood and watched her longer than he meant to. He saw her set the scale flat on her knee and study it. He saw her lips shape a word he could not hear, and then shape it again, and he understood watching her that she was going over the case the way a man checks a sum. He is afraid he has got wrong, laying the symptoms out one against another, testing each conclusion for the flaw that would let her believe the comfortable thing the rest of them believed. She found no flaw. He watched her, find no flaw, watched her face, settle into something that was not stubbornness but its opposite, a kind of grief held at arm's length. And he knew that. Look, because he had worn it. She was not waiting for payment. She was not waiting to make trouble. She was waiting to be allowed to save a life. And she would wait, he saw, until they threw her out by force, or sent for her in earnest. He had stood that way himself once, outside a different door, with a different woman dying behind it, and a confident man telling him all was well, and he had let himself be reassured, and he had carried the cost of that reassurance for 2 years against his heart. He did not announce himself. He could not just then have spoken. He did not announce himself. He went back up the stair, and within the half hour Mrs. Doyle came down to the kitchen and said that the Duchess was asking for the midwife again, and asking with a thread of panic in her voice, and that her hands had begun to tremble in a way the wine had not settled. Eleanor was on her feet before the old woman finished. She took up her bag and she climbed the back stair 2 at a time, and she went into the blue bedchamber past Dr. Pelham, who rose with an exclamation of outrage, and the dowager, who came to her feet with her fan snapping shut, and she went straight to the bed and put her hand on the Duchess's wrist and felt what she had feared. The pulse was wrong. The face was wrong. The reflexes, when she tested them with the heel of her hand against the knee, leapt too hard, and that was the sign her father had underlined twice in the margin of his book, the sign that meant the fits were coming and coming soon. It is here, before the worst of the night, that I will ask you to stay close. What happened in that room across the hours that followed is the heart of this story, and it turned on one woman's refusal to be sent away. Eleanor straightened from the bed and turned to face the highest-ranking people in 3 counties, and she told them the truth in the plainest words she owned. She said the Duchess would have a fit before morning, and that when the fit came, the child must be brought, and that if they waited for the natural course the way the doctor advised, they would bury mother and child, both by the feast of St. Andrew. Dr. Pelham laughed a short, ugly sound and said that he would not be lectured on midwifery by a midwife. The dowager turned to her son and said in a voice pitched to Carrie that this was precisely the danger of admitting such women, that the creature was frightening a delicate girl with village superstition, and that she should be removed before she did real harm. There it was. Again the dismissal made into a verdict. Eleanor did not argue. She had learned that arguing with certainty only hardened it. She did something else instead. She turned back to the young woman in the bed, the girl of 19 who had been handed from her father's house to this one like a parcel. And she took her trembling hand and she said quietly that she would not leave her, that whatever was decided about the rest, she would stay in the room until it was over. The Duchess gripped her hand and would not let go. The Duke watched his wife's fingers close around the midwife's hand. He watched the girl who had been silent and obedient and afraid for the whole of their brief marriage find in this stranger something she had not found in any of them, and he made a decision that the dowager had not given him leave to make. He said the midwife would stay. He said it once, levelly, the words like flat stones laid down, and when his mother began to object, he said it a second time, and the second time ended the discussion. Dr. Pelham gathered his instruments with shaking hands, and informed the Duke that he would not be answerable for the consequences. And the Duke said that he had not asked him to be, and the physician left the room. The dowager remained rigid in her chair by the window, a sentinel of the old order, watching it bend. The night that followed was the longest of Eleanor's life and of the Duke's. She set the room in order the way her father had taught her to set a sick room, every needful thing within reach, the candles trimmed and grouped where their light would fall best, the basin and the linen and the small bottles from her bag laid out on a cloth in the order she would want them. She sent Mrs. Pruitt to keep water at a steady boil and not a rolling one. She set Mrs. Doyle to tearing linen into the lengths she named. She wrote 2 lines on a leaf torn from her father's book and gave it to a footman and told him to ride for a surgeon in the next parish, a younger man named Whitfield who, alone among the men of physic for 30 miles, would lend his hands to a midwife and take her reading of a case without insult. The fit came near 2 in the morning, as she had said it would. It was a terrible thing to see, the young body seized and rigid and the breath stopped, and Eleanor had known it was coming and had readied for it across every hour of that long evening. And still her hands shook as she worked. She did not let the shaking into her voice. Through all of it she spoke low and even, naming each thing she needed in the same steady tone, because she had learned in 6 years that a frightened room takes its fear from the loudest person in it, and she would not be that person, not while a girl of 19 had only her to stand between her and the dark. The Duke stayed. He did not retreat to his study to wait for word the way the men of his house had always done. He stood at the foot of his wife's bed through the whole of it, and did what Eleanor told him to do, fetched what she said to fetch, held what she said to hold, and somewhere in those black hours the distance between the Duke of Ashbourne and the village midwife became something else, something neither of them had a word for and neither of them would speak. Near dawn, with the worst of the danger past and the child safely brought, a small daughter who cried with a strong clear voice that made the cook weep into her apron, Eleanor sat back on the stool by the bed and found the Duke looking at her across the room. The candle had burned low between them. The young Duchess slept, at last truly slept, her color coming back by degrees, the infant tucked in the crook of her arm. Eleanor was emptied out, past speech, her sleeves bloodied to the elbow and her father's scale forgotten in her apron pocket, and the Duke crossed the room to her and stood before her and did not, for a long moment, say anything at all. Then he said her name. Not the midwife, not Miss Hartley, even. He said Eleanor low, as though trying the weight of it, and it was the first time anyone in that house had called her by her given name, and something in her chest came loose that she had held tight for 6 years. He told her in the gray light, the thing he had told no one in 2 years. He spoke low, not looking at her, but at the window where the dawn was coming up gray over the frost, and the words came slowly, as though each had to be lifted from a great depth. He told her about Charlotte, his sister, younger than him by 3 years, and dearer to him than the title or the lands or anything the world had handed him, dead at 21 in a room not unlike this one. There had been a physician then, too, a confident man, with letters after his name, promising that all was well, that the labor was ordinary, that the girl's terror was the natural terror of the young, and Charlotte had begged. She had caught her brother's sleeve in the last clear hour and begged him to send for someone who would listen, anyone who would listen. And Marcus had looked at the confident physician and the calm older women and the whole weight of the household, leaning toward the comfortable verdict, and he had told his sister to rest, to trust the doctor. That all would be well. She had died before the next morning. He had been 31 and the head of a great house, and he had not had the courage to trust a frightened woman over a confident man, and it had cost him the person he loved most in the world. He drew the folded letter from his coat, the letter Charlotte had written him in her last clear hour, and that he had carried 2 years against his heart. And he did not read it aloud, but he let Eleanor see that it existed, that this was the shape of the grief that had frozen his face into the stillness the household called coldness. He said that when Eleanor had stood in that room the day before and warned him, he had heard his sister's voice, and that the dismissing of her had been the act of a coward who could not bear to be right twice too late. He had turned her out, he said, because believing her meant believing. He might have saved Charlotte, and had not. Eleanor understood then that the cold man was not cold at all, but a man who had been so badly burned by his own silence that he had mistaken silence for safety. She did not offer him comfort in soft words, because she was not a woman of soft words. She told him plainly that he had listened in the end, that listening in the end was the whole of it, that his sister would not have wanted him frozen at a door for the rest of his life. And the Duke, who had not been spoken to so directly by anyone since his sister died, looked at this exhausted woman with blood on her sleeves and her father's scale in her pocket, and felt the ice over the river of him begin, for the first time in 2 years, to give. The household did not soften so easily. By the time Wenlock woke to the news that the Duchess and her daughter both lived, the Dowager had recovered her composure and laid her plans, and her plans did not include a village midwife seated by right at the heart of the family. Over the days that followed, while the Duchess mended and the infant thrived, Lady Ashbourne worked the quiet machinery of the house against the woman who had embarrassed her certainty. She let it be known in the drawing rooms of 3 counties that the creature had got above herself, that she had bullied her way into a sick room and would now no doubt expect reward, that a house which permitted such women had lost its bearings. The dismissive label, spoken first in private and then in the sick room, now traveled the county as a third-party report carried by callers who repeated it behind their fans. And she pressed her son, daily, to settle a sum on the midwife and send her back to the village before the gossip did the family lasting harm. There was, too, a cousin. The Dowager had summoned him from town, a polished young man named Mr. Crane, who stood to inherit a neighboring estate, and whom she had long intended for some useful alliance, and she arranged for him to be much at Wenlock during the Duchess's recovery, much in the drawing-room with his easy laugh and his well-cut coats, much at the dinner table at her right hand. A living reminder to her son of the kind of company a duke was meant to keep. Mr. Bree and Crane was not a cruel man, only an idle and agreeable one, and he played the part the Dowager had written for him without ever quite knowing he had been cast in it. He spoke of the season in town, and the horses at Newmarket, and the families whose daughters were out that year. And he was careful never to address the village midwife at all, which was its own kind of address, a way of marking the boundary of who in that house was real and who was furniture. Beside Mr. Crane, in the Dowager's staging, the midwife was meant to look exactly what the Dowager named her, a woman of the wrong sort, lingering where she did not belong. Eleanor saw the staging for what it was. She had no illusions about the architecture of the house or her place outside it. She had meant to go back to the village all along, to her cottage and her scales and her 200 children, and she began to gather her things a second time, and this time no one stopped her. At the gate. The dark moment came at the dinner. The Dowager arranged to mark the Duchess's return to health, a dinner for 30, in the long dining room under the portraits, with Mr. Burkeet. Crane at the Dowager's right hand, and the midwife not invited at all, but lodged still in the house, pending her departure. It was the Dowager's stroke, before the assembled county over the soup. She spoke of the recent unpleasantness as a thing now safely past, and she said, with her fan held high and her voice pitched for the whole table, that the midwife would be gone by morning and the house restored to its proper order. That one did not, after all, keep such a woman about. However lucky her guess had proved, a guess. She had named the saving of 2 lives, a lucky guess in front of 30 witnesses, and the table murmured its agreement because the table took its opinions from the head of it. And the young Duchess, still weak, flushed and looked at her plate and could not find the courage to speak, and Eleanor, who had come to the door only to send word that she was leaving, heard the whole of it from the threshold, and felt the old wound open, clean through. She might have gone then. She had her bag in her hand. The Duke, though, had risen from his place at the head of the table. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. He set down his glass, and he stood, and the room came quiet by degrees, as the great rooms do when the highest-ranking person in them stands. And he looked the length of the table at his mother, and then he looked at the woman in the doorway, with the worn boots and the canvas bag. He crossed the room. He crossed the whole length of that long dining room, under the eyes of the county, past Mr. Sebley, Crane, past the dowager whose fan had stopped halfway to her face, and he came to the threshold where Eleanor stood, and he took the bag from her hand and set it down. The silence in the room was complete. Even the servants had stopped. He said so that every soul at that table heard it. "This woman saved my wife and my daughter. She stays as my honored guest." It was 11 words. He did not say more. He did not catalogue the dowager's cruelty, or list the night's labors, or make a speech of it, because the saying of it plainly was the whole of its force, and a longer speech would have made it smaller. He simply named what she had done and claimed her a place, and in the naming he overturned, in front of the very people who had delivered it, the verdict the House had passed on Eleanor Hartley. The dowager's fan came down slowly to her lap. She did not fragment into tears, for she was not that kind of woman, but the certainty went out of her face the way color goes out of the sky, and she looked, for the first time in 30 years of governing Wenlock, like a woman who had been wrong and knew it before a room. Down the table the young Duchess found her voice at last and said, clear and trembling, that she owed this woman her life, and her child's life, and would not hear her called less than she was, and the murmur of the table turned, the way a tide turns, all at once and without apology, toward the woman in the doorway. Mr. Crane, reading the room as polished young men do, was the first to rise and bow. The dowager left the table early that night, and she did not appear at breakfast, and the house held its breath waiting to see what she would become. What she became, over the slow weeks of that winter, was a quieter woman. She did not embrace Eleanor. That was not in her. She ceased, though, to work against her, and once, finding the midwife in the nursery with the infant, she stood a long moment in the doorway and said stiffly that the child had a strong color, and that she understood she had Miss Hartley to thank for it. And that was as near to an apology as 30 years of architecture would allow her, who understood the cost of even those few words, received them as the surrender they were. Eleanor did not become a duchess. This is not that kind of story, and the codes of the house were not overturned in a night, nor should the listener expect them to be. What happened was quieter, and, in its way, larger. She stayed through the winter as the Duchess's companion and the infant's guardian, and she made herself useful in the way she knew, sitting with the young mother in the long afternoons, teaching her the small arts of the nursery that no one else in that grand house had thought to teach a girl of 19 handed from one household to another. The Duke found reasons to be much in the nursery. He came in the evenings on the pretext of seeing his daughter, and he stayed past the seeing of her, standing at the window or sitting in the low chair by the fire, and the distance between him and the midwife, that had no word for it, narrowed by inches across the cold months. It narrowed in the shared silence over a sleeping child whose small fist had closed around the Duke's finger and would not give it back. It narrowed in the brush of a hand as she passed him a candle, and his fingers stayed a moment against hers before either of them drew away. It narrowed most of all in the particular way he had begun to say her name, Eleanor, no longer testing its weight but resting in it as though it were a word he had decided to keep. She felt the narrowing in her own body before she would permit herself to know it, the awareness of exactly where he stood in her room without her looking, the warmth that climbed her throat when his voice came at her shoulder, the steadying of her own hand on the back of a chair when he came near. Her mind, which had been schooled by 6 years of disappointment, told her nothing could come of it. Her body, which her father had taught her to trust above all the books, told her something else. He did not declare himself in haste. He had learned the cost of haste and the cost of silence both, and he meant this time to get the measure of the thing exactly right. When at last he came to her, it was in the long gallery, on a still afternoon with the winter light coming pale through the high windows, by the portrait of Charlotte that he had at last lifted from the wall and turned to face the room again. He stood before it a long moment. The sister he had failed, looking down at him with the painter's borrowed half-smile, and then he turned to Eleanor, who had come at his asking, and did not yet know why. He did not make a long speech then either. He told her that he had spent 2 years frozen at a door, listening to a voice on the other side, and unable to make himself open it, and that she had walked up to that same door in November with her worn boots and her canvas bag, and opened it without waiting to be asked. He said that he had buried one woman because he had not the courage to listen, and that he had nearly buried a second, and that the difference between the two was standing in front of him. He asked her then not as a duke asks, with the certainty of rank, but as a man asks who knows the answer might be no, whether she would stay at Wenlock, not as a guest and not as a servant, but as its mistress, and let the county say of it whatever the county pleased. Eleanor, who had never expected to be chosen by anyone, let alone by him, was quiet a long moment. Then she said yes, and she said it plainly, in the voice she used for the truest things. They were married in the spring, in the small church at Wenlock, with the frost gone from the lawns and the first green coming back, and it was a quiet wedding, the dowager present and composed, the young duchess radiant with her daughter on her hip, Mrs. Doyle weeping openly in a back pew, and Dr. Pelham, who had left the county in some haste, not present at all. That night, the first night of the spring, the great house at Wenlock was warm. A fire burned in the hearth of the room that had once been the cold blue bedchamber and was now the nursery, and snow that had no business falling so late in the year came down soft past the dark windows, the last snow of the winter, melting as it touched the glass. Eleanor sat by the fire with the infant who was her goddaughter now, and would grow up calling her aunt and then in time something warmer, and she held in her lap her father's small brass scale, worn smooth at the edges by 2 careful hands across 2 careful lifetimes. She turned it over, once in the firelight, the way she had turned it over at the lodge gate in November, when she could not make her feet carry her away, and she set it on the mantel where it would stay. The Duke came and stood behind her chair and put his hand on her shoulder, and neither of them spoke, because the speaking was done. Outside the snow fell and melted, and inside the firelight the scale caught the light and held it, the small, true thing that had measured out a life, come at last to rest in a house that had learned, late and at cost, to weigh a woman by what she was. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's story. If it moved you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you and stay warm.